Welcome to the Elokus podcast. This is class number 9 in the discourse Shlach Lecha Anashim and Mazel Tov, because this is our 100th class in the since we started. This is the 5th discourse in the book that has over 144 discourses, and then there's a whole section that I think is not divided in discourses on the monumental teaching of the 5th Chabad Rebbe, and this is the 5th discourse in his book, and we are holding in chapter 19, and this is class number 4 in chapter 19, but number 9 in this discourse Shlach Lecha Anashim, and number 100 in the overall learning that we started at the beginning of the book. So you got all your numbers over there. Okay, so we were left with an important parenthesis over here on page Lamed, as I mentioned, for those who want to look inside, and again, which book I told you which one I'm using. And the first parentheses in chapter 19, right? Is it the first parentheses? Yeah, it's the first parentheses in chapter Yotes and Perek Yotes. Okay, so we were learning over here. The great question is that how can we speak of 10 spheros, hagnuzos, 10 hidden spheros in the Ein Sof, and at the same time say that they're all sitting together and they're all as one in the soul, in the soul itself, or in the Ein Sof itself. All the spheros are one, and they're not contradicting each other. Yet there is 10, and they're opposites from each other. So if you remember, he said in the beginning that this is something that really is l'mayla min hasaga. It's something that's beyond our understanding. To really understand how they can be one at the same time, they are essentially opposites from each other, and how they can be totally one. In other words, there's no nekuda in the soul. There's no point in the soul where you say this is where this power is and this power is. Or there's no nekuda, there's no point in the Ein Sof to say that this is hanging out on the right side and he's hanging out on the left side of the Ein Sof, of the Ein Sof. There's no right side and left side. And over there, and yet there, it's all together. It's all one with the soul. And again, the main emphasis that we're not talking about a state where it's pre-kochos, pre-powers, pre-spheros, because then we wouldn't call it the 10 hidden spheros. The fact that we're in the pre, there is pre-infinite, pre-endless types of manifestations, revelations, and powers. We're talking about already the beginning of the existence of the spheros, and yet we're saying that they're not exist. The main answer that he gives is because they're not in a state of existence. But that itself needs to be understood. So what's their existence in this non-existent state, and how can they live together? Now, one of the things he mentioned was we might kind of think that perhaps when they are in their original source, they're weaker then. This, that they don't get along, is when they gain strength. When do they gain strength? When they emerge. But when they're in their source, perhaps we would argue that they're in a weaker state. So even the weakness of them allows them to kind of sit together with each other without protesting, without firing at the opposite power, without protesting the opposite power, without exploding against the other one, because they're in a weakened state. But he argued, and he said the exact opposite. Every power, when it's in its essence, is stronger than it in its expression. Kol kat, this is a very, very strong line he said. The kol be'emes, he said, I'm going to go back a little bit before the parentheses on top of page Lamed. Had a kol koyach, every power, kamoishu atzmi, as it is in its essential state. We'll understand that better a little bit in today's parentheses. Harehu, in today's learning, harehu b'toikif b'yoser. It's stronger than when it comes out. So if fire can't tolerate water, or water can't tolerate fire, which would then translate into the energies of fire and water, which are kindness and discipline, kindness and judgment, chesed and gevura, kindness and might. If fire can't, when they're in their express state, then for sure in their quintessential essence, in their substance of being, for sure they are much stronger, and they are opposite of each other, and therefore how can they both be together? So he answered that it's above our understanding. Yet at the same time, he gives a parenthesis, which he tries to lower it down. And then he says, but we know that's the way it is. In other words, without giving an understanding, we just know this is the way. He says we can sense that that's the way it is in our intelligence, even though we can't have an explanation of how that works. But over here in the parentheses, he's going to try to give us somewhat of an understanding of how it works. And although he seems to leave it that essentially it's above understanding, but yet he's going to give an explanation. Kind of like some kind of a scientific kind of an explanation for it. And let's read inside. We can say the inyana feichius, the idea of the contradictory nature that there is between fire and water, which would mean on a more higher and in a more original state, the difference between kindness and severity. But he's going to use fire and water because that's closest to our world, so we're able to analyze it in a more tangible way that is closer to our analytical skill, our analytical eye. Okay, so he says that what we can argue and maybe say like this, that the opposing qualities of fire and water is only when the element of fire and the element of water come forth into expression. Shabbat, because once it comes into expression, it comes b'pchinas tzior, mugbal. The expression of any entity, whenever it expresses itself, every expression already gives more design and definition to an otherwise undefined power. Which means that revelation, when something comes from essence into revelation, the revelation of it is always more constricting and more limiting of it than it is in its essence. So what is that really being saying? It's saying that every single thing exists on two levels. It exists in its essence. That means what is its inner substance, its essential beingness, and then there is its revelation, its presentation of self. Now, the presentation of self is always, as we said earlier, it's weakening. Once it's being presented, it's weakening. But every revelation of something has to design itself. It has to define itself so that it can reveal itself. And that's why when we speak about the or, the lights, immediately once lights are coming out, we're already mentioning that there is chesed, there are the 10 sefirot. Remember we said that in the essence, the light is really higher than any sphere. We said, remember we learned in chapter 18, I think, even before chapter 18, maybe, not in chapter 18, in last discourse. We learned there's 3 levels in the light. We learned the first level of the Or Ein Sof is even beyond Sfirot. It's even beyond to say that there are infinite Sfirot. It's higher than the whole concept of Sfirah. Because on that level, the light is still in the essence. When the light emerges from the essence, which is already revelation, Gilui, when the Or comes out into a state of Gilui, into a state of revelation, when it comes into a state of revelation, it then already, you have to speak of, it reveals it, but since it's Ein Sof, it has infinite Sfirot. And why do you have to say there's Sfirot? Because the revelation has to express itself in something. So the Ein Sof of it is that it can be anything. It can reveal itself in infinite different ways. Because that's already revelation. Revelation needs already a certain tziyur, a certain design. And then when the revelation becomes even revealed to somebody, to the world, it narrows down into 10. Remember we had that idea. So what this basically tells you is that there is the thing as it is for itself, and there is the thing as it comes into expression. And when it comes into expression, it gets definitions. And therefore he's going to say something really interesting. He wants to say that the contradictory natures of, let's say, fire and water is not in the essence of the fire and not in the essence of the water. The essence of what fire is and the essence of what water is totally not opposites. They're brothers. They're perfectly coexistence, can have coexistence with each other. They're not intimidated by each other. They don't feel the other one. They're not opposites even. But when water emerges into the revelation of water, into the definitions of water, then it picks up the definitions of water. And when the essential fire comes into be a revealed fire, it picks up the properties that fire has and the expressed expression of fire. Boy, oh boy, these two are sworn enemies. They're totally opposite one from the other, and they cannot be together. And therefore, we're going to say like this: the essence gets along with each other not because it's weak. Really, the power is much stronger in its essence than its revelation. This, that it becomes contradictory to each other, is because it goes into being a metzios. It goes into it being with certain properties. That itself is an enormous diminishment. That's a limiting of it. The fire gets limited once it expresses itself into the known properties of fire. When it's in its source, it's maybe 1,000,000 times stronger, but it doesn't have the properties that make it contradict water. And the same is with the water. The water in its essence doesn't have the properties that make it contradict the fire. So the contradictory elements of fire and water are only when the fire and water go out of essence into expression. And that will explain how these powers, when they're in the soul, can be one with each other. Now, it sounds like, what does that mean? So actually, he's gonna give us something to work with. He's gonna give us words over here to work with. Again, let's read it over here. The inyana, maybe we can say the inyana hafchiyas, the contradictory opposing elements is only in the expansion of the matter, whatever the matter is. Sheba, which when something comes into revelation and into expression, it comes b'pchinas tzior. It already designs itself in a certain design. Mugbal, a limited design. Varehu hafchi mitzior zolase. So then it is opposite from an opposing form. It's like you have a blank piece of paper. You can make a triangle, you can make a circle. In the abstraction of the paper, it's either or. It's okay. It can be both. But once you already design and you bring forth the triangle, then the triangle is opposing the circle. So the circle is opposing the triangle because it came out. It came out into its actualization. Avala etzem, but the essence, that does not yet in a tzior, it's not yet in a form. But you'll argue with me on the triangle and the circle, they don't exist in the paper. It's not like the essence of the triangle is not a triangle and the essence of the circle is not a circle. A plain piece of paper, the plain white sheet of paper doesn't have not a triangle, not a circle. True, but here we want to say that the essence of the fire and the essence of the water don't have the properties of fire and water that contradict each other. Ukamai, but he's going to give us an example to that regarding fire and water. And it's really beautiful. Eshu Mayim, fire and water. She'esh, we know, what are the properties we know about fire? That fire, number one, is bright, it's luminous, and it's also hot. Fire is hot. Water is not necessarily bright. I don't know if it's dark, but it's not necessarily bright. Doesn't have that feature. But the most important for our conversation over here is that water is naturally cold. Unless you warm the water up, then you apply the fire to it, then it gets warm. But really water in its natural state is cool. So usually you go to water to cool off. Fire is to heat. So now the heat of fire and the cool and the coldness of water are the opposites of the two features. But the question is fire when fire is in its essence, is fire hot? And is water, when water is in its essence, is water cool? In other words, is the heat and the cold, the temperature of the fire and the water, is that of its essence, or that's already part of its limitation of its expression? So he's going to argue that it's part of the limitation of its expression. It's almost like fire is dressing itself in heat. When it gets dressed in heat in order to emerge. And water gets dressed in coolness in order to emerge. But the naked fire and the naked water, meaning it in its essence is not hot and the water is not cold. And because it's not hot and that's cold, they're good with each other. That's the idea that he's going to prove it to us that the essence of fire is not hot and the essence of water is not cold. Where do you see that? We know that there are four elements, and in ancient philosophy and Hasidic and Kabbalistic in Hasidism and in Kabbalah and in all philosophical works, Maimonides and so on and so forth, see the entire substance of the material world made up of these four elements: fire, wind, earth, and water. Now, these elements, the essential elements of them, he says, the fire is not two things. Number one, it's not bright, and it's not hot. Bright, it's not, he doesn't say over here, but there's a mimer from the Alter Rebbe where the Alter Rebbe says that the essence of fire is not bright. Because, he says, we know that these four elements also exist independently according to the way Maimonides explains it in the beginning of the book of Maimonides. He talks about the four elements, and he says that really there are four circles, four spheres surrounding each other. So the element of earth is really the lowest. It sinks to the bottom. That's why physically, when you see the earth, around it is water, and really the entire earth should be surrounded with water. Above it is air, ruach, wind, and above that is fire. But the Alter Rebbe says, since the fire therefore is above the atmosphere, if the element of fire in essence would be luminous, then there should be a glowing light surrounding the earth all the time. We should never have darkness. We shouldn't have nighttime, and we don't need the sun to give light. We should be a ring of fire around everywhere we look, because the fire is above. So from there, the Alter Rebbe proves that the element of fire is not bright, the essence of it. He says, when you make a vessel for it, which means when you strike a match, you light a candle, which means you take that essential, what we might call potential energy, the fire, the potential, the essential fire energy that's in the atmosphere, and you give it a form to express itself down here. You pull it down on the wick. That's when the fire takes on a shape and a form of illumination. And it also becomes hot at the same time. And what would be the proof that the essence of fire is not hot? What would be the proof? Also the same thing. The fact that we're not burnt, that all of the world doesn't get burned by the element of fire. Because if the essential element of fire, where there is fire really definitely around the atmosphere, we'd be under a circle of fire. And in addition to that, there's fire really in everything. The fact that it's not burning is a sign that the essence of fire is not hot. It's not luminous and it's not hot. Yet when it comes into expression, it is luminous and it is hot. The same idea we'd say regarding water. The essence of water is not wet. In its essence, water is not wet. And it's not cool. It doesn't say it's not wet. He says it's not cool. It's not cold. The coldness feature of the water is when the water comes into expression. But the essential element of water is not cold. And that's why when you have fire and water, in essence, they can be together. Because what makes fire and water contradict? It's not the essence of the fire and the essence of the water. It's the heat of the fire and the coolness of the water. But that's not its essence. That's part of its expression. So when do they become clashing forces? When they come into expression, not when they're in essence. That's the idea. So this can serve as an example of how, when we watch a lot of times powers that are contradictory to each other, realizing when we dig deeper into the core essence of what it really is, there's no conflict. The two can be together because it's only in their tzir. And this will, again, let's follow this along, but we learned yesterday. But he said that when things come into a state of mitzios means it's in a state of somethingness. That's when it picks up certain defining properties that define it into expression, and each thing has its defining properties, and those defining properties could be contradictory one to the other. But in essence, it doesn't have these properties. Let's read inside. Like fire and water, she'esh cham, that the fire is hot, v'mayim kar, and water is cold. So they are opposite one from each other. And they can't mix. And if you try to bring the two together, boy oh boy, either one of the two, they go at each other's throats. They wrestle with each other. Each one is prevailing over the other. Sometimes the fire drinks up the water, or the water extinguishes the fire. Either the fire sucks up and dries the water up, there's no more water, or the water puts out the fire. This is when the fire and water come into a state of ispashtus, of expression, which has to do with revelation. That's when they go into a form of heat and in a form of coldness. But in the essence of the elements, it is known that the element of fire in its essence, the fundamental element of fire, is not hot. Because if it was hot, it would burn the entire world. And the same is also the essential water, is not cold. The alkane, and therefore, even though that they are, these powers are etzem, and etzem over here means essential powers, which means they're stronger even than they are in their expression. They're less limited. They're far more. This is the core. This is the true substance of it. But which means they're stronger, not weaker. They're not enemies because they're not opposite. In their essential state, there's no conflict. Now, but watch this. What happens when a power reveals itself? When a power comes into expression in a revelation, that's when it picks up properties. And when it picks up its properties, then it can become conflicting, as we see in fire and water. However, that's a minus, meaning that would create, in other words, that's a problem maker. Again, what we're going to call a problem over here is the problem that the fire and water can't get along. Okay, let's call that for the sake of it. That's a problem maker. Let's call that a minus. When the fire and the water come into manifestation, then the fire becomes hot, the water becomes cold, they're intolerant of each other. So let's call that a minus. But on the other hand, there is also a positive factor. What's the positive factor? Is that the fire coming out from its hidden state and going into expression, every expression is weakening it. So now the fire becomes weaker. The water also becomes weaker. So you have a plus and a minus for peace. If you're talking about peace, you have a plus and a minus when fire and water emerge outward. The minus is that they become actually opposite in their nature. The plus is that they're weak. They're weaker. And due to their weakness, you can kind of negotiate negotiate a coexistence between them. For example, if you put a pot in between the water and the fire, you've actually negotiated a coexistence. You get water, but you get hot water. So you get the benefit of fire and the water, and they live together, right? You negotiated if you don't put the pot in between, and the fire and the water will kill each other. But now you can create a harmony between them. Why is that? Because when things come into expression, they're weaker, and you could figure out a way how to bring them together. So on the other hand, you created the whole problem because they came into expression. But on the other hand, there is a weakness. Now, what he's going to add now is, hypothetically, how would we have two minuses? What would be two minuses? The two minuses would be like this. If fire and water, both of them, would come into expression, and they wouldn't weaken when they come into expression. So the fact that they came into expression, number one, would put them into certain properties, puts the fire into the hot zone, and puts the water into the cold zone. And if we wouldn't have the quality that meaning we wouldn't have the idea that every expression, every essence when it comes into expressions weakens, and the strength, the potency of the fire would fully manifest in its expression. If the full potency of the essence of fire would manifest in the expression, and the full potency of the essence of water would manifest and come forth in the expression, then you would never be able to negotiate a truce between the two. Then they would be such enemies like you've never seen, which we don't have. So it's not that the reason why they're getting along is because they're weak. The reason why they're getting along before they come into properties is because they're not opposite of each other. The properties are only the opposition one to each other is only in their garments. Meaning, once they come into manifestation and into they naturally the fire puts on garments that is different than what water will garb itself in, and those garments are completely opposite one from each other, are warring elements one from the other. So look what he says. Therefore, even though the fire and the water, when they're in their essence, are essence, right? And if they would come forth, if they would come into the properties of fire and water, as they are, without reducing their power, when they come in, they would be, the heat of the fire would be non-negotiable. It would be hot, but like crazy hot. The temperature of fire would be, I don't know how much stronger. And the cold would be way colder than the coldest cold that we know. If the essence of water would come forth into expression of coldness, but as it really is, without weakening. So the way things are, whenever things come into expression, they also weaken. So therefore you have a plus and a minus happening. The minus is that things are going into property, into its individual properties, conflicting properties. But the minus is, that's the minus. And again, we'll call it a minus in as much as we want peace. But the plus is that they get weaker. So the hot is not so hot, and the cold is not so cold. And that's why we can figure out a way to finagle it. They wouldn't have any attachment at all one to each other. Nevertheless, and we're going to put this in. I think I have an example from human interactions, which I think will help us understand this better. However, as they are in their essence before they come into properties, which means before they garb themselves in a certain image, they don't have heat and they don't have coldness at all. That's why they can attach themselves, be completely mixed one with each other. And it doesn't mean that they're mixed together because they kind of are integrated. It's not that they're integrated, it's just that they're not a contradiction. The inyan is arvus, and when we say they're mixed over here, ein zeh she'en klulim zeh mizeh. This does not mean that they integrate and one includes the other. No, in their potent essential state, each one is it and not the other. And there's no integration where one integrates the other. But they're also not in conflict with each other. They can dwell together. The fire is not for itself, and the water is not for itself. They share the same space. They sit together and they're completely okay. Not that they include, because when they will emerge into openness, there is you'll see that they're contradicting and so on and so forth. But in this state, they're tolerant of each other because they're not opposites. Nothing to be tolerant. They're not opposites. Okay. Perhaps we can use that as there's another way where you can mix things together that are opposites. That's why we're going to contrast it. There are ways where you can when you can bring things together, and that comes precisely not from revealing their essence where they're not opposites, but the other way around. By pulling forth more revelation, pulling it more into expression, which make them be more opposite, but precisely because of that, you start playing on the weakness of revelation. when something reveals itself, it starts getting weaker and weaker. And the more it's revealing, the weaker it's getting, in the sense that the more diffused it's becoming. And then you can pick up on certain weaknesses, and then you can start bridging bridges with opposites. Let me try to give a quick, perhaps, and you know what? I thought I'm going to go there, but I don't want to pull this. To do this right, it'll take another 10 minutes, so let's leave this for Ezra Hashem for tomorrow's class. Meanwhile, let Mashiach be here now.